The church hierarchy
Alright guys, we are back. We're going to listen to the Balkans,
which was, in any event,
a short
not
history,
common among
part
Balkan
3.
Muslims. But temporary marriages were a different matter. The practice of contracting a liaison with a woman for a specified sum over a limited period, noted as early as 1600 by William Biddulph, had a natural appeal to Christians as well as Muslims. Eventually, the church was forced to acquiesce in this practice, which became fairly widespread during the 18th century. In some areas, it turned into a means of earning a dowry, a kind of legitimized prostitution. If a stranger should wish to enjoy any one of the young unmarried women, noted a bemused Lord Charlemont in the Cyclades, he addresses himself immediately to her parents and demands the girl in marriage. The bargain is presently struck, and the couple are brought before a magistrate, where they swear mutual fidelity during the man's residence on the island, the bridegroom engaging to pay at his departure a great sum of money, as well as a present advance. This money is set apart in the girl's portion, and with this, later still, the Albanian-born Ottoman official Ismail Kemal Bey would marry a Greek woman, abducting her, with her consent, in order to overcome the objections of her stepmother. And below the level of the elite, there were numerous other instances of Christian-Muslim relationships. Conversion offered Christian women trapped in unhappy marriages particular advantages. By converting to Islam, they automatically obtained an annulment of their marriage, unless their Christian spouse converted too. There was a special formula for this. Saka was honored with Islam in the presence of Muslims.
Guys are rushing in.
Court heard, and she took the name Fatma. Her husband was offered a chance to go to Islam, but he declined. In a similar case, a woman named Fatma bint Abdullah registered her conversion to Islam. And it was noted that my husband Yano bin Manoya was invited to submit to Islam, but he did not become a Muslim. He acknowledges that he has no claim against Fatma. It is striking that Muslim marriages, too, were affected by the merest suggestion of apostasy. As we read in an 18th century Islamic legal compendium,
question, armor, dude.
Zayd and his wife Hind go to church and approve certain actions of the infidels, which entail unbelief. Must Zayd and Hind undergo a renewal of faith and a renewal of marriage? Answer, yes. In an article written in 1993, Samuel Huntington, an American political scientist, discerned in the war in Bosnia a clash of civilizations, and situated the Balkans on one of the global fault lines of this clash. Whatever the merits of this as a vision of the future, it must now be evident that it cannot serve as a model of the region's past. The Ottoman state and its religious leaders marked out clear distinctions among Islam, Orthodoxy, and Catholicism. But in daily life, these distinctions were less pronounced. In this border zone, in the Eurasian balance of power, many potential frictions, whether indigenous or brought in by outsiders, were blunted or diffused by shared local practices.
Nice.
Customs evolved to offer security and insurance across the religious divides. In the ceremony of blood brotherhood, young men of different families and even different religions swore loyalty to each other. From Livno, where Venetian, Habsburg, and Ottoman power collided, we have a Turkish account of a battle in the mid-17th century that ended with the capture of numerous Christian prisoners. When, as was customary, the victorious Pasha ordered the execution of his share of the captives, one of his own soldiers pleaded for the life of one of the prisoners to be spared. Asked for an explanation, the soldier replied, "During the battle, I gave this infidel my religion." Fastest growing religious movements of the 17th and 18th century Balkans, the strain of Islamic mysticism known as Bektashism. Bektashi doctrine, counterposed to the formal hierarchies of Sunni Islam, asserted that a saint belongs to the whole world. According to a late 19th century pamphlet, the Bektashi believe in the great Lord and in the true saints Muhammad Ali, Khadija, Fatima, and Hassan, and Hussein. They also believe in all the saints, both ancient and modern, because they believe in good and worship it. And as they believe in these and love them, so also do they in Moses and Miriam and Jesus and their servants. The Bektashi adapted Christian saints' shrines and renamed them after their own. Other sites, which genuinely were founded by the Bektashi, were visited by Christians as sanctuaries of their saints. In such a setting, religious boundaries dissolved easily. "I thought you were all Muslims here," a British traveler asked the priests at one Bektashi tekke. "So we are," they told her. "But of course, we keep St. George's Day." Linked for centuries to the slave converts of the Ottoman court, Bektashism spread throughout southeastern Europe with the empire and became popular in much of southern Albania, where it remains entrenched even after the fall of communism. Albania was perhaps a special case from the point of view of religion. "We Albanians have quite peculiar ideas," one notable told Edith Durham. "We will profess any form of religion which leaves us free to carry a gun. Therefore, the majority of us are Muslims." The light way religion hangs on an Albanian was familiar to many of the 19th century, but leaving the world of ignorance of the infidel religion for the true faith was for many in the Ottoman world a less momentous or sudden step than it has come to seem to us, for whom conversion summons up images of apostasy, existential angst, and personal and national betrayal. Movement into a new faith was often an accretion of new beliefs to older ones, rather than an act of renunciation and immersion. Indeed, converts frequently preserved older religious practices and habits,
Rushin_N_Tiger. We're also listening
to
to
avert the
audiobook
suspicion that their attachment to Islam was not entirely sincere.
Balkans: A Short History.
They painted
Very
red
interesting.
eggs at Easter, while Muslim converts from Judaism, the mysterious Donmeh,
Listen to The Art
were
of
said to
War.
preserve their old religious practices in the privacy of their
Muslim
homes.
Book of Five Rings. It's Rush.
The uses of secrecy also lay
_N_Tiger.
behind the custom of double naming,
Guys are
in which a Suleiman turns out also to
Audiobook.
be known as Constantine, Hussein as Georgi. A double name allowed one to dodge between inconvenient official categories, also serving to keep a man's real name hidden. Franciscan priests in Albania threw up their hands in horror when their charges persisted in calling themselves not by the baptismal Christian name, but by an assumed Muslim one. But the young men who did this could not be brought to abandon the practice. What better way, they urged in self-defense, to prevent a witch laying a curse on one than concealing one's real name? Whether against sorcery or tax farmers, or in some cases against the investigators of the Venetian Inquisition, multiple names were a weapon of the weak against the strong, of the private individual against the greater powers of the divine and the secular world. Revelation of one's real name thus marked a decisive moment of individual assertion against power. The life of St. Elias preserves the fateful conversation that preceded his martyrdom. Having been led to embrace Islam, as we are told, by his desire to escape heavy taxation, the saint is asked, "Are you not Mustafa Arduris?" "Yes, it is I," he replied. "But I am not Mustafa. Rather, I am Elias, the Orthodox Christian." The boundaries among religions were not completely permeable, however, and coexistence did not mean toleration. The Armenian and the Greek were dogs and pigs, to be spat upon, notes a British ethnographer in the late 19th century. Even before then, members of the ruling religion were often contemptuous in daily speech of the infidel dogs. Travelers were impressed by the variety of insults in general use. Pera is called the Hog's Quarter, perhaps because, contrary to the custom of the Turks, the Franks inhabiting it eat hog's flesh. And the Turkish soldiers, who are appointed to attend on foreign ambassadors, are termed swineherds. They call the Italians people of 1,000 colors, that is to say, cheats. The English, linen drapers, the French, knaves, the Germans, roistering swearers, the Spaniards, idlers, the Russians, cursed ones, the Poles, chattering infidels, the Venetians, fishermen, the Wallachians, rats, the Moldavians, sheep without horns, or stupid boors, the Greeks, hares, the Armenians, dirt-eaters, the Jews, dogs, the Arabians, silly fellows, the Persians, redheads or heretics, the Tartars, carrion-eaters. "Abdi called me infidel, son of an infidel," complained Mustafa bin Mehmed in a 17th century Ottoman court, outraged at suffering the kind of abuse routinely inflicted upon the false believers. Mehmet Bey called me a Jew, asserted another. Christians could not so easily complain. Their second-class status was brought home in the widespread conversion of many of their churches into mosques. They rarely obtained permission to build new churches, especially in areas inhabited also by Muslims, and they could not ring church bells in such areas, but had to call the faithful by beating wooden boards with clappers. In Servia, a French traveler from the Levant noted in 1836, "The Christian religion is entirely unrestricted. We were agreeably surprised by the sounds of bells, which we had not heard for so long." But even this was sometimes regarded as a provocative demonstration of infidelity and banned. In the countryside, the differences between Muslim and Christian were not hidden, and the two communities lived side by side. Nor were their daily interactions always characterized by tension or conflict. A Bulgarian memoir of life in the 1870s recollected, "Turks and Bulgarians got on well together. The women of a village quarter bordering on Turkish houses mixed with the Turkish women in a neighborly way, while the children played with the little Turks as with their own playmates. The Turkish women and children spoke Bulgarian quite well, and the Bulgarians, like their children, managed to get by in Turkish, the result being a sort of mixed patois. Those Turks who worked at Bulgarian houses were accepted as close friends. We were used to the Turks. We Bulgarians lived our own life, to be sure. We had our own dress, our own customs, and stuck to our own faith. While they lived another way, had other customs, and other costume. Their faith was different too. But all this we took as being in the order of things." In the cities where the Muslim presence was stronger, the dynamics of interaction were often rather different, marked by concentrations of rumor, of fanaticism, and of violence against non-Muslims. Constantinople was a dangerous place for non-Muslims until the early 19th century. At Ramadan, they kept off the streets if they were prudent. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissaries often attacked Christians and Jews with impunity. After the elimination of the Janissary Corps, this threat declined, and modernization brought the emergence of a new, shared bourgeois culture, which again ran across religious boundaries. For the first time, patterns of settlement in the larger urban areas were based on class rather than religion. The houses of prosperous Christians, which before the liberalizing Tanzimat reforms usually had a deliberately unprepossessing exterior, so as not to attract attention, became more grand and ostentatious in the latter decades of the 19th century. Muslims, Christians, and Jews mingled in the labor unions, guilds, and bourgeois clubs of Salonika. Class distinctions may not have effaced religious categories, but they created other bonds of solidarity and interest. Or might have done had the empire appeared more stable. The condition of intercommunal relations was a matter of time as well as space. The rise of Catholic Austria and Orthodox Russia brought new tensions to the empire's religions. Relations between the Orthodox and Catholic Church worsened markedly from the middle of the 18th century. Earlier, they had been surprisingly cordial and cooperative. And in the 19th century, of course, the emergence of Greek and Serbian nationalist movements challenged Ottoman attitudes toward orthodoxy. Hence, the moment of apparent constitutional liberalism in the empire was also that of growing Muslim unease at Christian hostility. Hundreds of thousands of embittered Tartar and Circassian refugees fleeing Russia's advance to the Black Sea arrived in Ottoman lands and settled in the Danubian provinces and Bulgaria. In particular, the reign of Abdul Hamid II from 1876 saw the Ottoman reaction against Western meddling in the empire's affairs. The 1876 constitution defined Islam as the religion of state, and increasingly popular and official anger against great power intervention took the form of mob violence, which exploded in massacres of Armenians in 1895 and Greek Christians on Crete the following year. As a recent historian has remarked, the Ottomans interpreted the Western demand for freedom of religion as freedom to defend their religion from the insult of Christian disrespect. The decline of Ottoman power intensified the sense of defensiveness among Muslims in this newly assertive Christian world. Modernity was thus sharpening the religious boundaries between communities in the last phase of imperial rule and giving them a new political edge. The older attitudes that were disappearing are evoked in the story of the martyrdom of a 17th century bishop of Larissa. Being of evil mind and evil conduct, we are told, he was beguiled by the words and promises of certain Europeans, and with the cooperation of the devil, and having gathered a sufficient multitude, he declared war upon the Turks, who reigned then. After a short space of time, he was captured and paid the just price of his deeds, being miserably put to death by the Turks, with the permission of God, he having done that which was unworthy of his calling. The story describes a world of rebellious Christian bishops and merciless Turks, but the Christian cleric is not a hero in the eyes of the Christian narrator, as he would be to later nationalist historians. He is a man led astray by the devil. The Turks may be cruel, but they killed the bishop in accordance with God's will. This story does not then describe a society free of conflict or religious antagonism. It depicts a violent and restless world, but also a world where Christians owe loyalty to a Muslim state. Above all, where human action is still understood in religious, not national terms. The Christian peasantry may have been influenced heavily in their beliefs, tastes, and practices by Muslim culture, but at the same time they carefully preserved folk songs and ancestral legends about the rebirth of a Christian empire. Predictions, laments, and prophecies had circulated among them ever since the fall of Constantinople, that fateful Tuesday in 1453. Serb Orthodox bishops and Maniot chieftains were constantly conspiring with Venetian and Austrian diplomats to revolt against the Turks. In 1657, a patriarch was hanged for rashly predicting the end of Islam and the revival of Christian domination. Russia's emergence as the first great European Orthodox power prompted prophecies about a race of blonde warriors coming from the north to drive the Muslims from Constantinople, the latest in a long line of such forecasts of Christian reconquest and Ottoman defeat. In 1766, a man claiming to be Tsar Peter III, Catherine the Great's unfortunate and dead husband, appeared in Montenegro and led a coalition of clans against the Turks. The impostor's activities provoked Catherine herself to send envoys there to proclaim her support for an uprising that would extend to Constantinople itself, capital of the ancient Greek Empire. The Montenegrins were not interested, of course, in recapturing Constantinople, but Catherine certainly was, and delegated her favorite, Count Alexei Orlov, to incite an Orthodox revolt against the Porte. Local Greek organizers of the 1770 uprising helped out, even if they regarded Orlov as a man whose imagination was inflamed from reading ancient history and mythological tales. Orlov proclaimed Russia's desire for raising and liberating the whole Greek nation. But although the local Christian peasants of the Peloponnese and Crete responded with enthusiasm, the revolt was crushed without difficulty by Ottoman forces. 40,000 people were killed, enslaved, or fled the region in 1770. Was this a proto-nationalist revolt? Perhaps. After all, in 1774, the Archimandrite Varlam wrote to Catherine the Great that her successes will undoubtedly serve to accelerate the much-desired moment of our complete liberation. But in 1779, Greek chieftains cooperated with an Ottoman army in the Peloponnese and negotiated with the illustrious Greek Phanariot Nicholas Mavroyianni in order to put down the Albanian irregulars who had been plundering the region. Inside the Ottoman Empire, there were many Christians, especially in the elite, who saw Russia's failure as a warning, especially since it falsified widely believed predictions of the Sultan's defeat. If God, constrained by our sins, may he forgive me for daring to say so, prevented that which was affirmed by the oracles from happening at the appointed time, wrote Constantine da Pontes. If, I say, he saw fit that the utterances of so many astronomers, scholars, and saints should prove vain in preference to giving the empire to men unworthy, not only of this empire, but of life itself, how is it possible that the resurrection of the Romaic Empire should happen? This being so, neither the Greeks nor the Russians will reign in the city unto the end of the world. May merciful God take pity on us and grant us the heavenly kingdom, and never mind about the earthly one. Yet curiously, Da Pontes himself, for all his resignation, was one of those Orthodox intellectuals who, by spreading the ideas of the European Enlightenment into the Balkans, provided a new vocabulary for imagining a post-Ottoman world. Initially, their contribution was not explicitly political at all. Trained in the new humanistic learning of Central Europe, and keen to synthesize this with orthodoxy, they preached the virtues of scientific knowledge, classical learning, and philosophy, and attacked the backwardness and barbarism of their own culture. With the spread of print culture, their writings multiplied. 7 times as many books were printed annually in Greek by Greeks at the end of the 18th century as at its start. Almost all such intellectuals emerged out of the bosom of the church and came to learning through the priesthood. Yet though they did not realize it, their devotion to scientific rationalism on the one hand, and to a secular rather than a biblical sense of history on the other, undermined the traditional bases of religious authority. It is this small literate elite who, while the vast majority of Ottoman Christians continue to inhabit the mental world described earlier, began to elaborate a new language of nations and ethnicities. The historian Paskalis Kitromelidis has described their goal as aiming to integrate the forgotten nations of the European periphery into the common historical destiny of the continent, replacing the old Orthodox conception of Christian time with a new secular understanding of time as national history. The intellectuals of the Balkan Enlightenment paved the way for modern nationalism. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Phanariot Alexander Mavrokordatos had divided history into 6 periods. From the creation to the Second Coming, that would be followed by a 7th period of endless repose in the eternal mansions. It was this biblical conception of time, in which historical epochs were believed to correspond to the days of the week, that was eroded by the new emphasis on the unfolding of civilizations and cultures. Ancient Greece in the 18th century and Byzantium in the 19th became aspects of the past, first to be rediscovered, and then to be renewed through political mobilization. History acquired direction. For much of the 18th century, the intellectuals' dreams of political emancipation rested, as Voltaire's did, upon an enlightened despot coming to their rescue, a Platonic philosopher king, a modernizer, in the mold perhaps of Catherine the Great, or Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II. The Russians remained a source of potential aid, notably during the 1806 to 1812 Russo-Turkish War, which brought Russian troops south of the Danube and made it look as if Grandfather Ivan would liberate Balkan lands. However, it was the French Revolution which first suggested that emancipation might come through the action of the masses themselves. The toppling of the French monarchy, the rise of Bonaparte, and above all, his invasion of Ottoman Egypt in 1798, radicalized the political thought of Balkan Christian intellectuals. Among the new breed of firebrands was a former secretary of the Phanariots, Rigas Velestinlis, who published Greek-language literature from Vienna calling for the overthrow of the Ottoman dynasty and the formation of a new republic based on the rights of man. Rigas's new political constitution of the inhabitants of Rumeli, Asia Minor, the archipelago, and the Danubian principalities, 1797, was the blueprint for a new Hellenic republic. The people would be sovereign, irrespective of language or religion. Modern eyes, attuned to future ethnic divisions, are struck by Rigas's assumption that the new state should use Greek as its official language. What struck contemporaries even more, though, was the absence of any reference to the church. For Rigas, the Ottoman dynasty and Orthodox Church were both to be swept aside in favor of an as yet ill-defined nation. Such radicalism frightened many, Muslim and Christian alike, by its godlessness and egalitarianism. Ottoman officials denounced the conflagration of sedition and wickedness that broke out a few years ago in France, scattering sparks and shooting flames of mischief and tumult in all directions. But in Austria, the Habsburg authorities were no happier and arrested Rigas and handed him over to the Ottomans, who had him killed in 1798. The Orthodox Church was also worried. The concept of political liberty, according to many bishops, was inspired by the devil, tempting the faithful away from their duty of allegiance to the Sultan. The patriarchal paternal exhortation, published in the year of Rigas's death, inveighed against the much vaunted system of liberty, which is a trap of the devil and a destructive poison, and reminded Christians how God raised out of nothing this powerful empire of the Ottomans in the place of the Roman Byzantine Empire, which had begun in a certain way to deviate from the Orthodox faith. And he raised up the empire of the Ottomans higher than any other kingdom, so as to show without any doubt that it came about by divine will. An anti-intellectual Greek satire that circulated in Constantinople at about the same time mocked the Francophiles. Romantic youths, enlightened notables, who say, "I am enlightened and I speak French. I myself will wear clothes in the European style." There was, in other words, both elite and popular resistance to the political ramifications of the new learning. Slowly, too, the old assumption that Greek, like Latin in the West, was the route to learning was being challenged as ideas of romantic nationalism, emphasizing the cultural value of peasant languages, spread into the Balkans. In the early 19th century, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Romanian intellectuals, often educated in Greek schools, began to define themselves in terms of cultural communities for the first time. They chafed under what they saw as Greek domination, doubting openly whether Greek was their language or Hellas, their fatherland. There are those, wrote Paisi Hilandarski in his Slavonian Bulgarian history, who do not care to know about their own Bulgarian nation and turn to foreign ways and foreign tongues. They do not care for their own Bulgarian language, but try to read and speak Greek and are ashamed to call themselves Bulgarians. But at the time, few in Hilandarski's target audience would have been able to read Bulgarian. The new ideas of political and cultural affiliation took time to trickle from the intellectuals, books and cities, down into the small market towns and homes of the unlettered mass of country folk. From the diasporas of Vienna, Trieste, Iași, and Odessa, to the heartlands of the Sultan's domains. Most people remained illiterate, ignorant of books and the new doctrines they contained, inhabitants of a much more circumscribed rural world. As late as 1810, for instance, there were only 2 elementary schools in the Pašalik of Belgrade, the core of future Serbia, and in both, the language of instruction was Greek. In Montenegro, the first elementary school opened in 1834. Romanianism was associated with the desires of the nobility to be rid of their Greek princes, and left the peasantry cold. As for Bulgarian nationalism, it had to await the opening of a few purely Bulgarian schools in the middle of the century. As nationalism began to eat away at its old constituencies, the Patriarchate tried to respond. Its traditional position, both accepting the distinctiveness of different Christian groups and insisting upon their common religious allegiance, was expressed thus by the Hellenes, the Bulgarians, the Vlachs, the Serbs, and the Albanians form today nations, each with its own language. All these people, however, as well as those inhabiting the East, unified by their faith and by the Church, form one body and one nation under the name of Greeks, or Romans, Romaioi. Thus, the Ottoman government, when addressing its Christian Orthodox subjects, calls them generally Romans, and the Patriarch it always calls Patriarch of the Romans. But the position of the Patriarch of the Romans was being undermined on several sides. Greek intellectuals wrote him off as a quisling, who is either a fool or has been transformed from a shepherd into a wolf. Slav intellectuals increasingly regarded him as a Greek. The Turks mistrusted him as a disloyal servant of the Porte. And in 1821, Patriarch Gregorios V, despite having issued a letter excommunicating the Greek revolutionaries, was executed. The emergence of Balkan nation-states after 1830 whittled away patriarchal power further. Self-governing peoples in southeastern Europe could not tolerate, any more than the Russians had done in the 17th century, the supreme religious direction of their citizens remaining in the hands of an Ottoman government official. The Eastern churches everywhere joined to the state, never being separated from it, never divided from the sovereigns since Byzantine times, and always subordinated to them, wrote one partisan of the new Church of Greece, which was formed in Athens in 1833, without the approval of the Patriarch in Constantinople. Others followed suit. The Bulgarians, even before they had gained an independent state, won a church of their own in 1870, the so-called Exarchate, after a long quarrel with the Patriarch over the need for priests who could conduct services in Slavonic. The following year, an autocephalous Romanian church was established. A draft law setting up a Turkish Orthodox church was even submitted to the National Assembly in Ankara in 1921, the logical culmination of the same process. A separate Albanian Orthodox church followed in 1929. Only the Serbs went the canonical route and obtained patriarchal authorization in 1879 to set up a church of their own. Each of these acts resulted in rupture with the Constantinople Patriarchate, which saw its flock gradually dwindling. In each case, the Patriarchate was eventually obliged to bow to new political realities. In exactly a century, the Patriarch's flock shrank dramatically from the entire Orthodox population of the Balkans and Anatolia to a few tens of thousands of believers, mostly in Constantinople itself. The most powerful, wealthiest, and successful Christian institution of the Ottoman Empire was virtually destroyed by the rise of Christian nation-states. However, the Balkan Enlightenment did not have it all its own way either. Its liberal and increasingly nationalist intellectuals might have attacked the church as part of their argument for the existence of national communities. But it was the peasants whose uprisings actually created the new nation-states, and they remained firmly attached to their church. Catholic missionaries had failed to make substantial inroads into Balkan peasant orthodoxy. American Protestant missionaries in the 1820s printed more than 1 million tracts and educated scores of young boys at a cost of $250,000, all for 3 conversions. It is scarcely surprising that the atheism of many 18th century Balkan intellectuals fell on stony ground. Christian orthodoxy, and religion in general, remained a major political factor in the Balkans after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But its character changed. Religion became a marker of national identity in ways not known in the past, and therefore more sharply marked off from neighboring religions. It turned into what the novelist George Theotokos called a national religion, which left no space for the kind of anti-church secularism that emerged in Western Europe and Italy in the struggle against Catholicism. Today, while the Catholic papacy remains a major political force in the world, the Patriarch of Constantinople barely clings to life, with jurisdiction over the few remaining Orthodox inhabitants of Turkey. In southeastern Europe, the modern nation-state, an entity no more than 2 centuries old, has entirely defeated the old Orthodox values. 3. Eastern questions. The world's great age begins anew. The golden years return. Heaven smiles, and faiths and empires gleam like wrecks of a dissolving dream. Percy Bysshe Shelley. If we inquire into the causes of the internal decline of the Turkish Empire and regard them under their most general manifestation, we must affirm that it is owing to the fact that the empire is opposed to another section of the world immeasurably superior to itself in power. That other section could crush it to atoms in a moment, and while suffering it to exist for reasons of its own, yet by a secret necessity, it exerts upon it an indirect and invisible influence. Leopold von Ranke. Over the long 19th century, which stretched from the French Revolution to the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1923, the political map of the modern Balkans emerged. Independent states formed according to the principle of nationality replaced the 500-year-old empire of the self-styled successor of the Romans, God's slave and sultan of this world, the Ottoman Padishah. The triumph of nationalism was partly due to the efforts of the Balkan peoples themselves, who had helped shake off Ottoman rule through their uprisings and resistance. But their efforts alone were fruitless until Europe's great powers intervened in their favor. The First World War was the culmination of this entangling of Balkan liberation struggles with the European state system. Foreign schemes for ending Turkish dominion in the Balkans went back to the 15th century, but became plausible only once Christian states began to put the port on the defensive. After 1699, Austria conquered Hungary-Croatia. Russia reached the Black Sea, and in 1774, having destroyed the Turkish navy in a protracted war, gained treaty rights to intervene in Ottoman affairs to ensure orderly government in the Danubian principalities, and also to act as protector of the port's Christian subjects. It was Poland, not Turkey, that was ultimately the victim of these two predatory powers, together with Prussia, at the end of the 18th century. One unintended consequence was that nation-states would emerge in southeastern Europe several generations earlier than elsewhere in Eastern Europe. The Polish partitions, however, did not sate the appetite of these monarchs. In a plan drawn up by Joseph II and Catherine the Great to divide the Balkans, Austria was to take over Bosnia and Herzegovina, part of Serbia, Dalmatia, and Montenegro, while Russia would control the rest. Catherine's grandson, the deliberately named Constantine, would eventually sit on the throne of a reconstituted Byzantine Empire in Istanbul. In 1787, the Austrian and Russian monarchs traveled together through Russia's newly won Black Sea territories, passing under a triumphal arch with the inscription, "The way to Byzantium." But Catherine's Greek project never happened. Far too many of the other great powers were interested in preventing it, and she had to rest content with annexing the Crimea. Far from supporting Balkan independence movements, these enlightened despots envisaged substituting Christian imperial rule for Muslim, the replacement of the Sultan by autocratic dynasties ruling over ever vaster polyglot realms of their own. The French Revolution, however, altered many of their assumptions. "According to my judgment," wrote the Greek fighter, Theodoros Kolokotronis, in his memoirs, "the French Revolution and the doings of Napoleon opened the eyes of the world. The nations knew nothing before, and the people thought that kings were gods upon the earth, and that they were bound to say that whatever they did was well done. Through this present change, it is more difficult to rule the people. Indeed, while the Russians continued to see themselves as supporters of orthodoxy against the Turks, the Habsburgs became increasingly conservative, and from Metternich on disliked the Slav liberation struggles on their doorstep. France and Britain wavered between supporting oppressed Christians against Muslim despotism and preserving the Ottomans against Russia. Balkan aspirations for self-rule were thus constrained by the competing and clashing interests of the great powers. The more one thinks about the immense question of the fall of the Turkish Empire, wrote Karl Nesselrode, the Russian foreign minister in 1829, the more one plunges into a labyrinth of difficulty and complications. The international management of this unpredictable process of Ottoman decline and national insurgence became known as the Eastern Question. Despite the empire's decay, Balkan Christians were too weak to win freedom without foreign support. They lacked the organization, leadership, ability, or will to prevail against what remained one of the world's major powers. It was not the unarmed infidels, but the now largely forgotten powerful Muslim elites, Bosnian beys, Herzegovinian capitans, Albanian provincial governors, the warlord Pasvanoglu in the Danube port city of Vidin, who posed the most serious internal challenge to the Istanbul government in the Napoleonic era. Constant rebellions in mid-18th century Bosnia led the Sultan to talk about the reconquest of the province. Over time, matters got worse. The pashas, or governors of provinces, are yet more independent of the Sultan than were the great barons of the crown in the feudal times of Christendom, wrote a British onlooker in June 1803. Almost the whole extent of European Turkey presents a dreadful picture of anarchy, rebellion, and barbarism. As the Sultan struggled to bring Pasvanoglu in the north under control, insubordinate local Muslim Janissary officers next door, in the tiny border pashalik of Belgrade, just across the river from Habsburg lands, were also carving out new fiefdoms for themselves. Of all the Janissaries of the empire, writes the 19th century historian Leopold von Ranke, none were more opposed to the Sultan than those at Belgrade. Aiming to establish their own power base, they murdered the Sultan's representative, the Vizier of Belgrade, for being pro-Christian, and then began to massacre his supporters among the Christian notables, Knezes as well. The latter took up arms in the name of the Sultan. Self-defense rather than the dream of independence was what drove them on initially. But the Sultan hesitated to accept their support. To arm Christians against Muslims, however loyal the former, however rebellious the latter, was an uncomfortable notion for the Porte. When, as a result, the Serbian Knezes appealed for help to the Russians in 1806, they thereby turned what had basically been a local insurgency into a liberation struggle. The Russians treasured the loyalties of Orthodox Christians, but they did not want the Ottoman Empire to break up and fall into Napoleon's hands. Moreover, once Napoleon invaded Russia, the Russians had their hands full, and a Turkish army regained control around Belgrade. Hence, the first Serb uprising ended in defeat, largely as a consequence of great power struggles in Europe. But it had taken the Ottoman Empire 9 years to put down a small border war against poorly armed and disorganized Christian farmers and traders. It was not a good omen, and it strengthened the modernizers' arguments in Istanbul for wholesale reform of the Ottoman state. Even worse was to follow. Not all Serbs fled abroad like the insurrection's leader, George Petrović, Karađorđe. How will it profit the Sultan to have an empty land? Reasoned one of the rebels, who decided to stay and to throw himself upon the mercy of Ottoman officials. What will Serbia be worth if all the Serbs are slaughtered? The wily Serb leader, Miloš Obrenović, also remained to serve the Sultan and was appointed Grand Knez in order to pacify the country. 2 years later, he assumed the leadership of a second uprising. In the spring of 1815, he first conducted his Muslim blood brother, Ashin Bey, to safety, and then proclaimed the opening of a new war against the Turks. Messages were sent around the country that the inhabitants should kill anyone they encountered wearing green clothes, the sign of a Muslim. On this occasion, the Serbs' timing was better. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo allowed the Russians to attend to their Balkan clients, and under Russian pressure, the Turks were forced to make concessions to the Serbs. A Turkish garrison remained in Belgrade, but Muslims were confined to the towns of the Pashalik. In return for reaffirming his loyalty to the Sultan, Miloš became its de facto ruler. Governing the Serbs much as the Pashas themselves had done, he sent the head of his political rival, Karađorđe, to the Sultan, assassinated others who disputed his authority, and hanged rebellious peasants. So far as the Porte was concerned, the arrangement brought peace in the tiny Pashalik at a time when far more serious challenges to Ottoman rule were afoot in Epirus and Bosnia, where well-armed local beys disputed the Sultan's authority. When the Greek revolt broke out, Miloš stood prudently aside to demonstrate his loyalty to the Porte. His reward came in 1828 to 1829, when another Russo-Turkish war led to further Ottoman concessions. His recognition as hereditary prince of Serbia and complete internal autonomy. From this point on, it was possible to see Serbia as a separate state. But before 1878, when it won formal independence at the Congress of Berlin, it could also be viewed more ambiguously as an autonomous Christian principality within the Turkish Empire, much like the Danubian principalities or the newly formed Principality of Samos, all of which offered forms of Christian self-government within the Ottoman domains. The ultimate triumph of the nation-state was still some way off. Perhaps the most formidable and durable of the Sultan's disobedient provincial governors in the early 19th century was the wily Ali Pasha, the venerable-looking but ruthless Albanian whose reach extended from his base in Yanina as far east as the Vardar River and as far south as the Gulf of Corinth. In the course of his lengthy struggle with the Porte, and amid complex double dealings with British and French diplomats, Ali contemplated using the Greeks. He knew that a struggle for liberation had long been plotted in Greek revolutionary circles in Odessa, Vienna, and elsewhere, and that the semi-secret, friendly society was laying the ground for insurrection. Ali spoke Greek, had a Greek Orthodox wife, and employed Greek advisors who urged him to convert to Christianity, and to whom he talked encouragingly of restoring the empire of the Romans. Greek schools flourished in his capital, Yanina, which was an important center of Christian learning and education. In 1821, the Porte mounted a campaign to crush Ali and sent troops against him in Yanina. As this was going on, not one but two Greek uprisings took place, hundreds of miles apart. The first and less successful occurred in the Danubian lands, close to the thriving Greek world of the Black Sea. Its leader was a Phanariot and former Russian army general named Alexandros Ypsilantis. Russia had become a major source of support for the Greeks, a center of wealth, conspiracy, and sympathy in high diplomatic circles. Ypsilantis himself had been an aide-de-camp to Tsar Alexander I. Ioannis Kapodistrias, who turned down leadership of the insurgency and later became the first president of independent Greece, was an influential figure in Russian diplomatic circles. Writing from nearby Kishinev, Pushkin described how the Greeks published proclamations which quickly spread everywhere. In them it is said that the phoenix of Greece will arise from its own ashes, that the hour of Turkey's downfall has come, and that a great power approves of the great-souled feat. The Greeks have begun to throng together in crowds under three banners. Of these, one is tricolored, on another streams a cross wreathed with laurels, with the text, "By this sign conquer," God's promise to Constantine the Great. On a third is depicted the phoenix arising from its ashes. Had Russia lent her support, as Ypsilantis had hoped, the Danubian uprising might have heralded the Byzantine imperial renaissance, which the Phanariots dreamed. But in fact, the Tsar was anxious to preserve the peace in Europe. The Emperor has highly disapproved of those means which Prince Ypsilanti appears to wish to employ to deliver Greece, wrote Kapodistrias to a friend. At a time when Europe is menaced everywhere by revolutionary explosions, how can one not recognize in that which has broken out in the two principalities the identical effect of the same subversive principles, the same intrigues which attract the calamities of war, the most dreadful plague of demagogic despotism? The rebels were easily crushed by the Turkish army after Romanian peasants refused their support as well. "I am not prepared to shed Romanian blood for Greeks," stated the Romanian insurgent leader, Tudor Vladimirescu. The main consequence of this failure was the collapse of Phanariot influence north of the Danube, and the eventual disappearance of an important center of Greek learning. A month later, as spring ushered in new fighting season, a second Greek revolt occurred far to the south in the Peloponnese, where the peasantry were mostly Greek-speaking, and where a major insurrection had already taken place at Russian prompting in 1770, with bloody consequences. The eventual success of this rising, rather than Ypsilantis's, meant that when a Greek state did emerge, it was not as a new Byzantium spread across Europe and Anatolia, but as a modest little kingdom, with a capital eventually based in the small Ottoman market town of Athens. But success was far from assured there either. At first, all eyes were on the struggle between the Porte and the rebellious and wily Ali Pasha to the north. In the Peloponnese port of Patras, Greeks were still hoping that the Muslim Albanian ruler of Ioannina would win and deliver them from Ottoman rule. In fact, the local Ottoman authorities feared the same thing. Unwittingly, they triggered off the Greek revolt by imprisoning those notables they could find as a preemptive move against Ali's Christian supporters. Faced with the choice of arrest or rebellion, many Greeks chose the latter and began to attack Muslim settlements. The cloud of darkness which overspread the westward for so many a year seems now to commence by casting its shadow of desolation and horror in this country, was how one British onlooker in Macedonia greeted news of the outbreak of revolt. This revolutionary spirit of independence seems to gain in other parts of Greece also. Perhaps 15,000 of the 40,000 Muslim inhabitants of the Peloponnese were killed by insurgent bands in the first few months. Survivors fled to the safety of towns and forts. That summer, Greek forces besieged and eventually sacked the provincial capital of Tripolis. The host which entered it, recollected one of the Greeks, cut down and were slaying men, women, and children from Friday until Sunday. 32,000 were reported to have been slain. About 100 Greeks were killed, but the end came. A proclamation was issued that the slaughter must cease. At the end of 1821, the leaders of the Greek revolt met in assembly, proclaimed a constitution, and appealed to Europe for help. Their sympathizers declared that Ottoman control of European territory was an eternal shame to enlightened governments. But the Greeks, like the Serbs earlier, were disorganized and quarrelsome. They fought among themselves and frittered away their early successes. After 1825, a well-organized Turco-Egyptian invasion force laid waste to the Peloponnese. History would at this point merely have recorded one more failed insurgency, had not Europe come to the rescue. Fearful that Ibrahim Pasha's army would enslave the Christians of the Peloponnese, George Canning, the British Prime Minister, warned that he would not permit the execution of a system of depopulation. Ibrahim was told to disavow or formally renounce the intention of converting the Morea, the Peloponnese, into a Barbary state by transporting the population to Asia and Africa and replacing them by the populations of those countries. Ottoman reprisals 3 years earlier in Chios, which had left thousands of Greeks dead and thousands more sold into slavery, had shocked the liberal conscience of Europe.
What's good?
And been immortalized by Delacroix. To keep an eye on the situation, the great powers sent a naval flotilla to the Peloponnese, which at the Battle of Navarino destroyed the Turkish fleet. The Egyptian army then withdrew under the watchful gaze of a French expeditionary force. In this way, thanks largely to outside intervention, an independent Greek state was formed
this
in
time of
1830.
night. Well, 48 verse
2 years later,
46.
the powers bestowed the youthful
about
Prince
28
Otto of
eyes.
Bavaria, a 17-year-old Catholic, upon the
It fills
country
up the room
as
with,
king.
you know, whoever's not here.
Historians often
there's
explain
40,
why what
there's
happened
80 players.
had to happen. In the case of the rise of the Balkan nation-state,
that's about 30,
their grand
30 AIs.
explanatory schemes attribute the success of Christian nationalism to emergent merchant diasporas and the impact of Western ideology. None of this would have counted had it not been for Ottoman military and administrative weakness, especially at the empire's fringes, and the changing international balance of power. The Serbs were militarily defeated by 1810, the Greeks by 1827, but they won their statehood nonetheless.
Hey man, your mic's a little
It is doubtful,
sensitive. It's
writes one
picking up
scholar,
your gunfire.
that the Serbs could have won independence from the Ottoman Empire without the full support of one or more major powers. The same was true for the Greeks. In both cases, the outcomes were tiny, insecure polities, pale shadows of the grand visions of resurrected empires whose prospect animated Balkan revolutionaries. The dominant power in the region was still the Ottoman Empire. After losing Greece and Egypt, the Porte finally smashed the obstructive Janissary Corps, modernized its army, and undertook a series of reforms. Ali Pasha was killed in 1822. The Bosnian Beys were defeated.
I know, right? All they do is crouch. They walk a little to the side, crouch. Walk a little to the side, crouch. They're the funniest fucking things ever.
By local Beys. The Raya had hitherto
sufficiently
suffered,
easy targets,
stated an Ottoman official in 1837, reproving landowners for forcing peasants to work on Sunday. It is the will of the Sultan that they should be protected and allowed the full enjoyment of their religion. There was still life in the sick man of Europe. Turkish troops defeated the Greek army in battle as late as 1897. There was economic vitality, too. Many Greeks and Serbs remained Ottoman citizens and showed little inclination to immigrate into their new mother country. Some, on the contrary, fled the high tax rates and poor prospects of the new kingdom of Greece for Ottoman Anatolia,
it's already
the ports of the Black Sea. The markets of the empire continued to attract Christian merchants, and Orthodox Christians still served the port as ambassadors and counselors. The two new states were impoverished, rural countries. Serbia was, in Lamartine's words, an ocean of forests,
piercing the sky.
with more pigs than humans. Serbian intellectual life in the Habsburg lands was far more advanced than in Belgrade. Perhaps 800,000 Greeks inhabited the new Greek kingdom, while more than 2 million still remained subjects of the port. No urban settlement in Greece came close to matching the sophistication and wealth of Ottoman cities such as Smyrna, Salonika, and the capital itself. There were, to be sure, impressive signs of revitalization for those who wished to look.
Shoot the dude, don't y'all see?
The rapidly expanding new towns built on modern grid patterns that replaced the old Ottoman settlements in Athens, Patras, Tripolis, and elsewhere, for example, or the neoclassical mansions and public buildings commissioned by newly independent governments. Some barracks, a hospital, a prison built on the model of our own, wrote Adolphe Blanqui from Belgrade in 1841, announced the presence of an emergent civilization. In fact, similar trends of town planning and European architecture Ottoman cities as well.
I heard it.
I didn't pull up in time, man. I got a little overzealous.
Had been in war.
Yeah,
Serbia,
I'm gonna spawn on you now, though, so I got tired of just fucking doing circles in the jet. I see. I got you. I'm behind you. Here's some armor, brother.
Immigrants from the Habsburg lands.
Oh, you're armor for armor. Hell yeah.
In Greece, there were similar struggles between regional factions, between supporters of the various great powers, who each sponsored parties of their own.
Oh, hell yeah. No, man, if you could just follow me, I'm almost at 50 followers. I got 48, brother. I'm so close.
Okay, I got you.
The new states enjoyed
yeah, brother. I'm gonna type in my name right up there.
The pride they took at having won a place of their own in the world was tempered by a keen sense of superiority vis-a-vis the powers.
That's you, right? Ruin, right?
Nor did their triumph mean that people in the Balkans immediately started thinking in terms of nation-states. On the contrary, Romania and Bulgaria were notions that as late as 1830 animated only a handful of intellectuals and activists.
You're rushing in, we're rushing in.
Albania and Macedonia, in all likelihood,
fuck yeah, now let's take A1.
In southeastern Europe, far from the nation winning itself an independent state, as romantic nationalists imagined, the leaders of new states
I play books on my channel too, audiobooks. Right now we're playing a book about the Balkans. Oh shit, I got shot in the face. Hey.
Serbia, noted Blanqui, owes to Milos the first roots penetrating its forests.
No, it's not a name.
Order
It's a real player, but he got killed.
The creation of Serbian
You killed him?
nationality.
Fuck yeah,
Yeah,
brother.
he shot me too.
The Danubian principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, the future Romania, were home to a miserably
Yeah, I was hoping you could
impoverished
rev me, but
Romanian-speaking
whatever.
peasantry,
So good, it's okay.
ruled by an indigenous
Yeah,
landowning
we'll take
boyar
it back.
class, and governed by Greek princes who
Yeah,
owed
yeah,
allegiance to the Sultan. Fought over by Turkey and Russia
5
for most
seconds.
of the 18th century, they were the
5
most
seconds.
important
2
example
seconds.
of
1.
those
Oh my
autonomous
God, you
provinces
are a fucking
inhabited
lifesaver.
an
God
intermediate
damn.
space between total
Oh, I'm so
incorporation
sorry,
within the
man.
empire
But that was
and
amazing.
good.
My Twitch is gonna love that,
After
dude.
the
1 second
failure of
left.
the
I'm like, there's
1821
no
Greek
way.
revolt there,
And
the
this dude
decline of
fucking
Phanaric
runs in
power
like a
left the way
goddamn
open for the
flash, like the
princes of
flash. Oh my
provinces
God,
to
that
be
was
elected
awesome.
from among the
What are you
Romanian
on spawn?
boyars
I want to
themselves.
see if there's any vehicles.
An important step toward the
right back where
creation
we were.
of a
A2?
native governing elite.
I'm going to A2, yeah.
The
Gotcha,
port was
brother.
obliged
A2.
to accept
You
this
can spawn on
change,
me if you want.
thanks to Russian prodding.
I already
in
spawned. I don't know if you
1826.
did it as well.
Throwing in
In
a solar
1829,
device.
after a
There you are,
campaign
there you
that
are.
took its
I'm about
armies
to-
to within 3 days'
Yeah, you
march
got the
of
proxy grenades?
Constantinople,
American flag
Russia
down on it.
imposed
Fuck
military
yeah,
rule.
let's do it.
Although the provinces,
glory.
like Serbia, remained
Raise it
nominally
up.
under the
Oh
Sultan.
shit, somebody's so flaming.
According
That's
to the
good. I
Treaty
got
of
a recoilless.
Adrianople, which
Oh
marked the peace,
shit.
the principalities were to
Damn,
enjoy the free
dude.
exercise of their worship,
He's over
perfect
there.
security,
Yeah,
and independent
yeah,
national
good
government,
shit, good shit.
and full liberty of commerce.
Kick this guy out.
New
But the
follower.
promise of national independence
Perfect
did not
frost
square with the
page.
reality
Dude,
of
you are
Russian
perfect.
military occupation.
That was an amazing
The
save when you
modernizing
ran
Russian
in at the last
administrators,
second.
influenced by contemporary
Try
British
to
and
do it
French
again
theories of
against
agrarian
Smoke.
reform,
Yeah, they happens,
intervened
dude,
far
with
more
that.
in the province's internal affairs
that's all
than the
right, we got
Turks
the-
or the
we got the
Phanarians
second.
had done.
Yeah? Awesome,
Yeah,
The
awesome.
church
hold
was
it.
subject
Yeah, I
to
think
the
that was
state as
mostly
in
our
Russia.
fucking effort too.
Bucharest
I
was
don't know.
transformed by town planners,
Gotta hold this
acquiring
second.
numbered
Gotta hold it
houses
on
and street
top.
names. Just 2
Yeah,
decades
B's
after
usually a
Berlin.
clusterfuck, man.
Lighting
Everybody's fighting
and
over
new
the
drains.
censor.
Like the Bavarians running Otto's kingdom of Greece,
Oh,
the Russians based
okay,
their
you too,
reforms
maybe?
upon theories of
Oh
enlightened
shit, I
conservative
accidentally spawned
bureaucracy.
on the MAV
With the organic
floating in the
regulations
DM.
of 1832,
Alright,
they
alright, whatever.
introduced
We're
a
gonna try to
cash
take
economy
D1.
into the landed estates, boosting grain production,
Boy, you can't shoot
formalizing
me.
the boyars' legal ownership of the land,
shoot too
and
good.
exacerbating class
Yeah,
tensions
yeah.
in the
I believe
countryside.
it, dude.
Great.
I believe it.
Before long, the Romanians'
Too
new
malicious
masters
to put
were as
bullets in
unpopular
your
as the
anus.
old.
Oh,
In the
I like that. I like
Revolutionary
that. That should be
Year
a
of
quote. I'm gonna quote
1848,
that in the description
Russian
of
and
the video.
Turkish troops acted together to suppress liberal nationalist
Maybe make it a
uprisings
clip or a
in
highlight.
Bucharest and Yash. Like that of the Greeks
This dude
before
think
them,
he's sweet.
the Russians'
Oh, get shot in the
influence
back.
among the
From
Romanians
above.
waned,
They on top of the
and the latter
crate.
began to
alright,
embrace
alright.
Latinism.
Barrage
particular,
missiles,
the
man,
culture
and
of
rocket
their
pods.
Latin
I hate when
sister
people make
nation,
their fucking
France.
MAVs
French
useless with
replaced
these
Greek in
goddamn rocket
fashionable
pods and
circles
barrage
and was
missiles.
used in official
Are
bulletins.
they useful
Where
at
are
all?
you?
Some
I'm
dreamed
an
of turning
MAV
Bucharest,
floating
the capital of Wallachia,
over here
into
by
the Paris of the Balkans.
Yeah, I see you.
Yep.
I'm on you.
After Russia's
trying to take
defeat in the
D1.
Crimean War, the French encouraged the idea of a union of the two principalities as a barrier to further Tsarist penetration toward Constantinople. French support
empty,
and smart
so-
maneuvering
I'm
by
gonna turn the
local
radio on. I think
Romanian
that's
elites
the
brought this
trick.
about. In 1859, the two provincial assemblies elected the same man, Alexandru Cuza, a card player who preferred Jamaica rum to public
You ever use
affairs,
the barrage
as
missiles or
ruler,
the
and the
rocket
two assemblies
pods?
voted for unification.
No,
In this
I just
strange way,
unlocked them.
Romania
Yeah,
came into
I
existence.
think they're useless, dude. I don't know,
So,
man. One of them does
it
lock
had to
on
wait
to
till
so flame
1878
shit.
for formal international
but-
recognition.
I forget which one.
Cuza's reign, like that of most rulers
And I think
of
they're
the new Balkan
useless.
states,
Man, you
was
kicking ass
brief.
over there? I got good footage
Though
of
he at
you.
least
I
avoided
see you.
assassination.
Damn.
He made enemies among the landowners by
Are there
his agrarian
they're up there in the
reforms
rafters?
and was pushed from power in 1866. As in Greece
Or whatever
earlier,
they are,
local elites failed to accept a native head of
Gotcha.
state, and a
up
monarchical
top?
house had to be imported from abroad.
Yeah, they're on the boat.
Prince Karl of Hohenzollern,
The
Siegmaringen,
actual boat.
a cousin
Okay, now
of the
the
King of
rafters
Prussia,
above the boat?
was said
I'm going
never
to
to have
see,
heard of
yeah, I'm going
Romania
to see.
before his nomination
Alright,
as
So I
its
can
king.
get a good shot at him.
Nevertheless,
Alright.
like his contemporary
Sniper
King
ass,
George
alright.
of Greece,
I'm gonna
a
keep.
good
go
boy,
clean
but not
house.
overbright,
Yeah, I'm gonna
and
be
a very plain youth,
spawn
Queen
point over
Victoria's
here. I'm
comment,
gonna act
I'm
as
gonna
as
Plain
King
C
Carol I,
first.
he enjoyed
okay.
a long and
Dude.
successful reign until his
more
death
power
in
to you, brother.
1914.
If anybody can do it, I think it's you. So
The emergence of
Our troops
Bulgaria
are
was
engaging, that
relatively
means I
late.
gotta go help them
In the
engage.
wake of the
Oh, yeah,
last
D1's
Russian invasion into
being
Ottoman
taken,
Europe
so we're
in
doing good.
1877, and highly
I
contentious.
see him hopping around. People are
Despite the
finally
presence of
spawning
a
on
small
my
Bulgarian
MAV. Not mine, but
and a
was
nationalist
mine, I
cultural
would've
and
been shooting.
economic
Three of
revival
them.
during the
Yeah,
19th century,
nice. Yeah, he's hopping
proximity
around
to
over here. I see.
Constantinople had made it relatively easy for the Turks and the Patriarchate between them to control the Bulgarian
that.
Slavs.
We'll try to.
A peasant
Look like we might
uprising in 1841 had been ruthlessly and effectively crushed by Albanian irregulars, and many Bulgarians had fled northward to the Danubian principalities, to Russia, and later to Serbia. What little revolutionary conspiracy as there was took place in the coffee shops and inns of Bucharest and Iași.
Oh man, I'm ditching
Armed
this MMA.
Bulgarian
It's
bands who
fucking
crossed the Danube were easily
we already got
crushed by
D1
Ottoman
anyway. Actually,
troops.
no, I'm gonna go back.
Bulgarian
and try
notables were
to
mostly pro-Greek in culture and loyal to the
What's
Sultan.
up? Where are you going? I'll
When
try
the
to back
Russian
you up.
scholar Yuri
If it's near
Venelin
the
visited
sea.
Bulgaria in 1830 to collect materials for his
C1?
pioneering historical and ethnographic studies of the Bulgarian people,
me in the back, so
he
I gotta
found them
stop and kill him.
apathetic and unresponsive to his
Got you,
inquiries.
brother. It's a
It
personal
was
vendetta
scarcely
now.
clear what it meant to call oneself Bulgarian.
Made it personal.
Even 40 years ago,
Damn, okay,
wrote an
well,
observer
fuck that
in
name, maybe.
1900,
think it might have been
the
a
name
tank.
Bulgarian was almost unknown,
Yeah.
and every educated
Kick
person
his
coming
ass,
from that
I'll
country called himself Greek, as a matter of course.
I got to transport.
Disillusioned
No, I
at the lack of
I'm
patriotic
going
feeling
to
among
C1.
peasants and
All right.
merchants,
That's the original plan.
and at the failure of
I'm
their
gonna take
efforts at armed insurrection,
the condor
Bulgarian
there.
revolutionaries turned to non-militant strategies and dreamed of creating an autonomous Christian
Oh,
Orthodox
there's a fucking jet
confederation
in the air. God
to share
damn it.
power with the Sultan. Hungary's success in creating the dual monarchy out of the Habsburg Empire in 1867 exemplified the benefits of a peaceful struggle. And for a moment, reform seemed possible
Bless
under
you.
the Porte too. Many Bulgarians lived in the model Danube vilayet, run by the
how the fuck did I end up
reformist
here?
Mithat Pasha, who appointed Christian officials on an equal footing.
Oh, C1's
at
right
least
under
in
me.
theory,
Okay.
with
If you
Muslims.
They going
wanna,
up in C, they
But
going up
most
in
of these
D1.
Christians
Yeah,
were in
but
fact
I'm
Polish,
marking them, too.
Hungarian, and
spawn
Croat
on the
emigres,
transport
rather than
hookup. Well, somebody
Bulgarians.
took it over. I was
And
gonna do the
Mithat
whole
himself was replaced
jumping
after 3
seats
years,
thing, but
victim of
fucking
the perennial
get
instability
shot
inside
all
the
in the
Ottoman
back.
administration.
Oh, shit.
Religious
There's not enough
changes
of us
did
over
more
here.
than
No, no,
patriotic
no.
activism
I
to
don't
shape
think-
an emergent
but
Bulgarian
I-
consciousness.
Get it.
American
trying to
Protestant
spawn back.
missionaries translated the New
Moving down on
Testament
the-
into a language
saw like 10
Bulgarian
of them
peasants
run
could
up.
understand,
Yeah. Oh, shit.
and thereby began to
Very
erode
good.
the dominance of Greek. Even so, the missionaries found
I ended
that
up
so
at
few
A somehow,
peasants could
and
read
I'm
their
dead.
own
There's
language
so many
that
at
they
A, it's not even
seriously
funny, man.
contemplated printing Bibles instead in
Right
Turkish,
here, I'm gonna add you.
Headed
written in
that way.
Slavonic characters.
All right, all
I'm
right.
I'm
In
headed
1849,
toward A.
following
Got you,
pressure
boss.
from Bulgarian guilds in Constantinople, a
Cavalry's
Bulgarian church was
coming.
consecrated in the grounds of the home
Wow,
of the
cool picture,
remarkable
dude.
Stefan Bogoridi,
I love
a
that.
counselor to the Sultan,
right.
Prince of Samos, and partly Bulgarian by origin. Further agitation against
Just be
Greek
careful. There's a
dominance in the
lot of them here.
Patriarchate
Like,
and against the
I
exactions
count
of
at
the
least.
bishops in the
Stopping at
countryside
C
led to the
first.
establishment
Yeah,
of
yeah,
a
yeah.
separate
Take C and
Bulgarian
then
church in
maybe
1870.
some of them will be.
Yet for long
I count at least a
thereafter,
dozen.
there were many Bulgarian-speaking peasants, as would become clear in Macedonia, who
All right,
considered
all right.
themselves
Now,
Greeks,
I'll spawn on
by
you.
which they meant not that they supported the expansionist schemes
Oh,
of the Kingdom of
no. Here, I
Greece
got you, I
to the
got you.
south,
All right, there's a
but that
sniper.
they
Yeah,
worshipped
yeah,
in
yeah.
churches run by the
In
Patriarchate.
that
All the
direction.
way on top.
A
Okay,
sense
okay.
that speaking Bulgarian implied
All right,
belonging
all right.
to a Bulgarian
there,
nation was slow to emerge.
Fucker, man, how did he get me?
In 1876,
Dude,
the
he got me
latest in a line of Bulgarian
through the damn
revolts
container. How the
failed
fuck
to
that
elicit
happened?
support among the peasantry or townspeople. The April uprising,
All right, I
writes
pinged him. He's
Bijalavic,
landing, or
which became the
somebody
major
is.
event
Yep.
in later
Somebody else
Bulgarian
pinging the
national
fuck
Yeah,
out
I'm
of him.
pinging the hell out
mythology,
of them.
Hell yeah,
was a
brother.
complete
Dropping
failure
down.
as a
Yeah, they
revolution.
They get killed.
Europe
Good,
was
good.
not much
Show 'em how it's
preoccupied
done.
by the
Fucking
100 or so
assholes.
Turkish civilians killed by the rebels. However, the Sultan, who was engaged by a serious insurrection in the Western Balkans, was alarmed at another insurgency
Back, yeah, I'm up.
so close to the
Back into
center of the
action.
empire,
Good,
and
good,
ordered
good,
its
good,
swift
good,
and brutal
good. You
suppression.
got me.
Yeah,
News of the
well, I might
Bulgarian
get in.
horrors
I gotta
committed
see.
by
Here we
Ottoman
go.
irregulars, with perhaps 12,000
I can see
to 15,000 Christians killed, attracted European concern, and even became the focus of a British electoral campaign. When the Sultan rejected European calls for internal reform, Russia invaded the Balkans in 1877, and after encountering
there he is.
surprisingly stiff Turkish resistance, eventually advanced on Constantinople. The peace terms dictated to the Turks that year established independence for Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, and thus marked the end of Ottoman Europe as it had existed for centuries. But the clause that created the greatest stir was the establishment of a vast new autonomous Bulgarian state, which would have extended westward to Skopje and the Vardar Valley, and south to Salonika and the Aegean. This was the so-called San Stefano Bulgaria, named after the treaty that gave it birth. San Stefano Bulgaria did not last more than a few months. The other powers, above all Britain, saw it as an unacceptable extension of Russian power into the Balkans. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, Disraeli insisted
Going
that
to
the
A.
new Bulgarian state be
Sure.
whittled
I'll
down
meet
to an
you
area less than half the size of that originally envisaged. Macedonia was returned to Ottoman rule, and a new area,
no
the autonomous province of Eastern Rumelia, was created between
score.
Bulgaria and Constantinople.
I only got 25 to 15
this
tickets
province
left.
was soon annexed to Bulgaria, and it took a mere 30 years for the country to move from being an autonomous principality,
this is embarrassing for
paying tribute to the Sultan, to full independence. But Bulgarians never forgot the state the Russians had originally promised them, and the lost lands of Macedonia, in particular, became the object of their dreams of
expansion.
expansion.
My last one for the night. It's 3 a.m.
The process of nation-building in the Balkans occupied the entire 19th century. It was protracted and experimental, and left many of the region's little people still subjects of imperial power, whether under the Ottomans or, as in the case of the Croats, Slovenes, Serbs, Romanians, and others,
That's
under the
mostly your
Habsburgs.
effort. Spark Dog, you ever run into him? He's usually with a guy called Spark Pup.
Independence, as many federalists inside and outside the Ottoman Empire had hoped.
Yeah.
But the preliminary to it,
have a good night, comrade.
the passage from autonomy to independence took over a century. In the case of the Danubian principalities, decades for Serbia and Bulgaria, and less than 3 years for Greece. Crete and Samos, which also won autonomy within the empire, became part of Greece before the First World War. The great powers were heavily involved in the new state's internal affairs. They appointed their kings from the unemployed scions of Europe's princely houses, drew up their constitutions, and selected teams of military and civilian advisors. From the Bavarians who ran Greece under King Otto in the 1840s,
all right, guys, we met some
to the
new good
Russians
friends
who ran Bulgaria, including its army and Ministry of War in the 1880s. They defined borders and adjusted territories at diplomatic conferences.